Hey Science 8s, it's Manchak here with your video lesson for Concept E3. Now, before I get into that video lesson, I just wanted to explain to you that today's video lesson, or this week's video lesson, is going to be different than the one I've done over the last 2 weeks. Based on your feedback on the survey, I found that you guys actually preferred the other way I was doing things, where we were just running through the notes together and I was sharing bits and pieces of information. So that's what we're going to do. I still have some YouTube videos to accompany what's going on with this particular concept, but we're going to switch back to the other kind of video lesson that'll be a little bit longer, and then you'll have the extra resource videos if you need them to further your learning. Don't forget, you've also got the textbook if you need to go through that to find anything new, and you can always track me down, email, come onto my office hour, something along those lines to help me out, or to help you out. Okay, so we're going to switch back to what we were doing in previous concepts. That's what I was trying to say. So I'm going to move myself over here, and we're going to just look where we've been and where we're going. So we started this unit on fresh and saltwater systems by talking about water distribution and water quality, where we find water in Alberta and around the world. We talked about things like watersheds. We talked about how much water there is on Earth, water, little bits about water quality and what can affect water quality. Last lesson, what we looked at was landforms, water, and climates. We talked about things like erosion and deposition. We talked about glaciation and how that impacts the landscape. Basically, we looked at how water can change the landscape that we have here on Earth. Today, what we're going to be looking at is, and this is our second last concept of the year, by the way, is we're going to look at living things in aquatic environments. So we're going to try to look at how salt and freshwater systems are a little bit different in how the organisms have to adapt to those systems, how water quality changes, and what sort of changes go on in those systems as time goes by. So we're going to look at short and long-term changes in populations. We'll analyze factors that contribute to the development of species found in saltwater versus freshwater environments, and then we'll analyze the relationships between water quality and living things based on things like diversity, which will be one of the first things we talk about. So that's what we're going to cover. I'm just going to skip back to this for a second and remind you guys of a couple of things. I'm going to go over what's most important right at the end of this video, so you can watch the video, and then I'll just sort of recap a little bit what I think are the most important things you guys need to know. Your textbook pages are 372 to 391 for this. I've got one video so far at the recording of this. If I find any others, I'll make sure I throw them in for you guys later on. But this one is this concept's a little all over the place, so it's kind of hard to find a really good video that matches up. There are some questions out of the textbook that you can do, but if you do one thing, please make sure you get the worksheet number 3 done for this before you move on to doing the practice quiz. Remember, do your practice quiz first, then wait for feedback from me before you tackle the summative quiz. So without further ado, I think I'm going to do the following. I'm going to drag that out of the way and drag this on. And I am going to hit the present button and get myself set up here for sharing with you guys this concept. All right, so we are living things and aquatic environments is what we're doing for concept E3, and we have a bunch of different things that we want to go through. So first thing I want to talk about is the idea of diversity. And for me, the idea of diversity, particularly biodiversity, is one of the big ideas of science, in particular, the big idea of the living sciences of biology in particular. So the diversity is the variety of different kinds of species in an ecosystem, and it's an important thing to look at when we consider the health of an ecosystem. This is a big thing for me, and I really want you guys, from this year on, to really watch out for when we talk about biodiversity. We will talk about it next year in Science 9, and it will crop up again in a bunch of other concepts later on. We should probably refer to diversity as biodiversity, because right up here I said species. Species refers to living things. So we're talking about species, we're talking about living things. So we should probably be talking about biodiversity, because bio means living. So biodiversity is super important. But which do you think is better? Is high biodiversity better or low biodiversity better? Maybe take a moment to think, or we can move on. So high biodiversity is better, and here's why. Okay, there's lots of reasons. I'm going to highlight a few here. There's more kinds of organisms around to help each other out. So, for example, more organisms for food if you're trying to find something that you need to eat, or more organisms to help keep the soil healthy, to do the decomposition and the breaking down that's necessary. So, high biodiversity is great for that. Another thing is if a natural disaster hits an ecosystem, a high level of biodiversity, so lots of different kinds of species in an area, helps the system to recover more quickly. That's because some organisms might be treated differently by that natural disaster than other organisms. So they might recover a bit more quickly than the organisms that did not get it or that got affected a little more. So it really depends on the organism, but higher biodiversity means that they're going to be recovering more quickly. From a human perspective, high biodiversity means better chances of finding cures or diseases or inspiration for new technologies. So, a lot of the discoveries that we've made over the last little while, many of them have been based on what we see in the natural world, maybe even chemicals that an organism in the natural world produces. And we go, oh, that helps fight that with them. I wonder if we can use that for us. And then we kind of, try to isolate the chemical and see if it works for us. When we go through biodiversity in biology 20, actually, when you get into grade 11, we talk a little bit about how biodiversity in even a like a farming ecosystem really helps things, because there's lots of different stuff that gets attracted to an area that is biodiverse, that helps to break things down better in the soil and replenish the soil better so things grow more easily. You get these nice little symbiotic relationships and relationships that rely on each other that really make an ecosystem thrive when there is high biodiversity. When there is low biodiversity, often an ecosystem is susceptible to major changes, and it could be very drastically affected depending on the situation. So what does this have to do with fresh and salt water? Okay, so remember, an ecosystem is a place on Earth where living things, biotic things, interact with other living things and non-living things. So what we call abiotic things. Okay, so we're going to be talking a lot about biotic and abiotic in this section, and talking about ecosystems. So an ecosystem is an area, and it could be, the crook of your elbow is an ecosystem because there's living things and non-living things interacting there. So it could be very tiny, or an ecosystem could be very large. It could be something the size of the boreal forest, where you have many thousands of different kinds of living things interacting with the non-living things, the abiotic things. Remember, abiotic means non-living, so it means that it is not made up of cells. And so we're talking about, the easy ones that people come up with. Rocks are non-living, water is non-living, salt is non-living, but there's other non-living things out there too that we'll explore a little bit later on, right? Like temperature is an abiotic factor. So is the acidity or basicity, how acidic or basic the area is. So is things like salinity. Salinity is how much salt there is in the water. Okay, so all of those things are abiotic and are important for us to consider. So diversity in aquatic systems varies greatly. In warm, saltwater ecosystems, life can be so abundant that it's hard to keep track of the biodiversity. Think of, if you've ever watched a video of a coral reef before, or even visited one, you may have seen ridiculous amounts of diversity in that coral reef. Well, that's a result of usually the warmer temperatures, the salt water that sort of keeps things warm. We also tend to find, though, that in cold freshwater ecosystems, life can be quite sparse, meaning there's only a few organisms able to adapt to the conditions there. And often that's because in those freshwater areas, maybe we're getting a place that freezes solid. in the wintertime. Or not completely solid, but freezes over, and there's other changes that go on in those ecosystems. So in general, we can say there is more diversity in salt water on Earth than in freshwater. Okay, simply because there's more different kinds of ecosystems in salt water. Remember, we have 97% of the water on Earth is considered to be salt water. So there's more diversity in that when we look at salt water. Guys, okay with that? All right, let's move on then. So what we want to talk about next is we're talking about all of these living things existing in salt versus freshwater systems, and why would we have, how do all of these living things sort of survive in these different systems? Well, they all have adaptations. Adaptations can be physical or behavioral, and they're ways in which an organism is changed, either physically or behavioral, that increases its ability to survive in an ecosystem. So just to give a simple example, not aquatic version of this, but let's think of a mouse. A mouse tends to be brown in color. It runs along the ground. The ground is often brown in color in areas. If you think beyond our lawns, right? If you're running on the soil, you're going to blend in with the background much more easily. Fish have some interesting adaptations as well. Often fish have darker colors above and lighter colors underneath. And what we believe that is for is the darker colors help to blend in with the bottom if you're looking from the top down onto the fish. And the lighter colors underneath help them blend in if you're looking from underneath, because what's up in water is going to look bright like the sky. And so you're going to be looking up at that fish to see if, and if the fish is light colored, it's going to blend in a little bit better. So those are adaptations, right? I'm describing camouflage in some ways. In order for aquatic organisms to live productive lives in their ecosystem, they need to have adaptations to make it suited to living in the conditions in which they live. So what are these conditions that organisms need to adapt to? This is a little bit different when we're talking about aquatic ecosystems, so fresh and saltwater systems. The things that the organisms need to adapt to are a little bit different. So, for example, if we're talking about a terrestrial organism, something that lives on land, the thing that is usually the most limited, the resource that is the most limited on land is water, often. Because in a lot of cases, it's the hardest to find water. In an aquatic ecosystem, you're living in water at that point. So water is not the most limiting factor. It might be air, it might be availability of oxygen for those organisms. So here are some important factors that I want you guys to be aware of and maybe be able to describe to me a little bit about them. So in aquatic ecosystems, the most important abiotic factors, okay, are that organisms must adapt to are temperature, light, pressure, salinity, and water movement. Okay, so temperature, how hot or cold is that water? And is that organism adapted to, let's say, for example, a lot of our freshwater organisms are adapted to water that might freeze over in the wintertime. So they're adapted to that. You try to take a saltwater fish and plunk it down into a lake in Alberta, it's probably not going to be adapted to that level of temperature. Light. And light is affected by usually more than anything how clear the water is, the turbidity of the water, which I believe we've used that term before. Is there lots of stuff dissolved in it, moving around in it, that makes it hard for the fish to see or the organism to see? Or is it very, very clear, like a nice crystal clear mountain lake? Pressure. Pressure would be, in this case, how much water is above you, pushing down on you. Right? Are you an organism that's used to living near the top of the water column and you're swimming around up here? Or are you one of those organisms that lives way down at the bottom and you're adapted to, hundreds of meters of water pushing down on you at the bottom of a lake or an ocean? Salinity is the big one here, right? Salt versus fresh water, right? Most of our fresh water around the world has even a little bit of salt in it. And then even some areas that would be considered freshwater have higher levels of salt than others. But really, salt water is what we're describing in our oceans, right? And that has a high level of salinity to it. Freshwater has a very low level of salinity, or very little salinity at all. And then the last one's really interesting to think about: water movement. What's water movement all about? Well, is the water flowing or is it not flowing? Are you living in a pond or a lake? Or are you living in a fast flowing stream or a slow flowing stream? Are you living in a tidal zone where water moves in or water moves out? Are you living in the wave zone where you got waves crashing over you all the time? Right? That's the water movement that we're talking about. So it's not just rivers versus lakes, it also could be what's going on in the oceans. So what I'd like you to do now, if you'd like to, is to take some time to do a little bit of research, some of the adaptations that organisms have to aquatic environments. And for each of these abiotic factors, research at least one really interesting adaptation for each of these that you can find. Just go onto the internet and type into Google, how does an aquatic organism adapt to temperature? Enter and see what you can come up with. Take the time to put that into your notes and come up with a few of these together. Normally, we would in class, we'd spend some time, we'd grab the Chromebooks, we'd sit and look at this, and then we'd share some of these around the class. But we don't have that opportunity now, so I'd like you to go do it on your own. So hit pause, go and do that. And when you're back, we'll switch to the next slide. So this, if you want to, you can take a break as well, finish that activity and do your practice questions, and I'm going to move on to this next bit. So this is talking about, we've talked about adaptations and how organisms have to adapt to the different abiotic conditions in their environment. What I want to talk to you about now is another thing that's going to keep coming up as we move through our biology stuff later on, and this is populations, and what a population is, and the difference between populations in fresh and saltwater systems. When biologists study aquatic ecosystems to determine how healthy they are, they often observe the size of a population or populations in that ecosystem over a certain amount of time. Why scientists focus on a population versus an entire ecosystem is that an entire ecosystem can be very, very, very complex, but a population is a little simpler to observe. Not certainly very simple to observe, but simpler to observe. You're really focusing in a population as a group of organisms of the same species that live in a particular area, usually at a given time. Okay, so a population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in a particular area. So an example of that might be the number of perch that we have, or the perch that we find in Pigeon Lake, or the the diving beetles that you find in the marsh outside your yard, or something like that. So be careful, don't confuse biodiversity with a population. Biodiversity is the number of different species in an ecosystem, while a population is the number of individuals of the same species in an ecosystem. So we're in biodiversity, we could be talking about, the beetles and the water spiders and the fish and the aquatic plants in an ecosystem. That's the biodiversity. Whereas a population is the number of individuals, the number of diving beetles in that specific ecosystem, that marsh or whatever we might be looking at. Okay. So why do we care about populations? Well, what do we watch for? Well, one of the things, if you're an ecologist that is studying aquatic ecosystems, is you might be watching for how the populations are changing as time goes by. A healthy ecosystem is an ecosystem where the populations remain the same level, the same population as time goes by. Maybe they go up and down a little bit, but they're not going up drastically and down and up and down. That's not a stable ecosystem. So a stable ecosystem, one that's not experiencing a lot of change, will have a population that stays relatively the same as time goes by. But populations are always changing. Okay, that means that stability might be stability year after year, but what might change is maybe over the course of the year, there's been little fluctuations in that year, right? Oh, it's breeding season, so all of those little diving beetles, the population is going to rise. But when there's more of them around, they might get eaten. Population is going to go down, right? And then, oh, well, breeding season again, population is going to come back up. Oh, they're getting eaten. Population is going to go back down. still maintaining relatively the same population, but we're getting maybe a seasonal change that's happening. In general, healthy ecosystems have populations that get larger or remain the same, whereas an unhealthy ecosystem will have a population that tends to fall over time. If I'm an ecologist and I'm studying an aquatic ecosystem, and I've been studying it for a few years, and I'm seeing that the population of perch have been dropping, I'm going to go, okay, there's something wrong with this ecosystem. Why is that happening? And so we would look at reasons for why that might be happening. There's three main types of changes to populations that we're going to examine: what we call seasonal changes, short-term changes, and long-term changes. Okay, a seasonal change should be pretty obvious by the name. These are changes that arise from the changes in seasons. Typically, these occur in freshwater systems because freshwater systems are more prone to freezing in the wintertime. So, for example, we find lots of invertebrates, things without backbones like bugs, aquatic insects, during the spring and the summer in our ponds and lakes. But in the wintertime, when the ice covers the water, these populations tend to drop. Okay, it's maybe not entirely true because those organisms may seem to disappear, but likely they are either in their egg or their larval stage crawling around on the bottom of the pond or the lake, and we may not actually see them. So the populations are there. But usually with organisms like insects, when the summer rolls around, that's mating season. We're going to lay a whole whack of eggs that are going to hatch into larvae under the water, and a lot of those larvae are going to get eaten. So we're still going to get seasonal variations. We're going to see the population rise rapidly in spring. We're going to lay those eggs. All of the adults are going to die off, and those eggs are going to go into the water, and they're going to develop into larvae. But a lot of the larvae are going to get eaten, so the population will decline, and then we'll stay that way for a while, and then we're going to get back to spring again, and then we're going to see that decline. So we'll get this sort of seasonal variation depending on what part of the life cycle those organisms are going through. We're probably going to see the same thing during spawning season for fish, right? And that's why when we're protecting a fish species, we don't allow spawning fishing during the spawning season for those fish, because they are the most susceptible to that time, and we're pulling individuals out of the population that are in the process of breeding. The next type of change that we're going to talk about are short-term changes. So this should be relatively self-explanatory. These take place over a short period of time. They don't last for very long, but they don't, however, happen every year. Otherwise, we call it a seasonal change, right? So that's the key distinction. Seasonal change, we can predict that the insect population is going to rise in the spring and then fall back down in the fall and winter. Rise in the spring and fall back down in the fall and winter. That happens every single year. A short-term change is something that doesn't happen every single year, so it's not a seasonal change. So, for example, a drought could cause a pond to dry up temporarily, forcing organisms to relocate. Here's a great example, and this is more of a long-term change, but Beaver Hill Lake dried up for a number of years, or almost dried up for a number of years, and was more or less not a lake anymore. It's now starting to come back, and that variation has disappeared. And when it fills again, those organisms will come back. So from our perspective as humans, that may seem like a long-term change, but maybe for those organisms, that's more of a short-term change. A pond drying up is much more short-term than, I think, a lake drying up. Let's not confuse that, though, with what happens with our sloughs around this area, because what's going to happen with a slough is it fills up with water in the spring. Invertebrates and other aquatic organisms go crazy in there, and then usually by middle to late of summer, that slough's almost dried up. That's seasonal. That's happening every year, okay? But if it dries up completely and disappears for a couple of years, that's not seasonal. That would be a short-term change. Now, lastly, long-term changes are alterations to an ecosystem that last for a while and can often cause more serious problems than the other changes. So, for example, a natural landslide could alter the course of a stream, changing not only where the stream flows, but how it flows. Okay. In the last lesson, we talked a little bit about those nice curvy streams that we have, those that make all of those oxbows and all that kind of stuff. That would be a long-term change too. Is as a bank erodes, we change the flow rate of the water, and it erodes even more, and we create those big zigzags that we get in those streams. That's a long-term change. Okay, and it changes the ecosystem significantly. Humans cause long-term changes too when we drain a wetland because we want to build houses there, or when we put a dam up in a river because we want to generate hydroelectricity, right? Those kinds of things are long-term changes that have significant impacts on the ecosystems. So short and long-term changes can be naturally occurring, or like I just alluded to, they can also be caused by human activity. So often human-caused changes are the hardest for an ecosystem to adapt to because we can have a major impact on those ecosystems with the actions that we have. So that's something for us to consider. Okay, some practice questions if you want to do them, but I'm going to wrap things up here really quickly. I'm going to jump back to this activity in a second here, because it'd be something nice for you to think about and wrap up later on. But let's talk lastly about water quality here and how water quality changes. Sometimes our aquatic ecosystems may seem perfectly normal, even though the system is stressed or struggling. But remember that it doesn't take much in the way of changes to water quality to upset the balance in an ecosystem. So depending on the size of the ecosystem too. I mean, if you've got a really big lake, a small spill of something into the lake may not have a major impact on that lake. But if you have a small slough or a small pond and there's a spill in that, it could have major impacts. The organisms that inhabit ecosystems are adapted to live under a narrow range of conditions. Okay, this is another big idea that we build on in further science courses. So let's say that we're talking about pH at this point, how acidic or basic the water might be. And let's say that the organisms are adapted to living in slightly basic water. And let's say that that's pH of 7.3, maybe as low as 7.0 and as high as 7.5. That's their comfort level. They do okay in that range of 7.0 to 7.5 for their pH. But if the pH gets too acidic, or if the pH gets too basic, those slight changes could lead to problems. It might make it harder for the organism to find food, to breathe, to do the chemical processes they need to do to survive. So remember those abiotic factors we talked about a little while back? Temperature, salinity, light. If these factors get messed with, like there's more or less than whatever we're talking about than usual, some organisms are going to be affected and some will be able to adapt. And those changes in the quality of the water are going to have an impact. Some might get impacted more, some might get impacted less. What's really interesting is that some changes in water quality seem to really benefit some organisms, but at the same time, it can have a significant impact on others. And this is a great example. And if you take any other science courses from me in the future, you're going to hear more about this, because this is a really important one for us here in Alberta to consider. Algal blooms, so those are blooms of algae, the green sludge that you see at the top of ponds and sloughs, starting this time of year, which is, I'm filming this end of May, can be caused by too much fertilizer finding its way into ponds or lakes. Okay, so we fertilize our fields, we get them ready for our wheat or our barley or whatever we're growing to grow super well over the summer season. But if we put too much fertilizer on, that causes problems, because the fertilizer is great for algae because basically they're a plant. They're a very simple plant, but let's consider them basically to be a plant. They take that extra fertilizer and they grow rapidly, covering the body of water in green. Okay, and those algae are doing great. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that first off, it's choking out light from anything that might be living beneath it, particularly photosynthetic aquatic plants that need light to do photosynthesis. That's difficult. The other thing that's going to happen is it's going to lead to a lack of oxygen, because there's going to be less photosynthesis. And then there's a double whammy with this, is as the algae goes through its life cycle and starts to die, it floats to the bottom, and all of the decomposers at the bottom are going to just beast at that point. There's so much algae. There's stuff, dead stuff falling down all over the place, that they're going crazy, and they're eating and reproducing and making more and more and more, and they're using up all the oxygen in that pond. And so what ends up happening is that pond becomes dead, in essence, because it's lacking oxygen at that point, because so much oxygen has been taken out by the lack of photosynthesis to put oxygen back in, and by all of those decomposers doing their thing and eating up using oxygen to eat up all of those algae that are falling down. So we basically end up with a dead pond where you're not going to find many big organisms living in it. You're probably not going to find fish in there. You're probably not going to find larger invertebrates in there. You might get a few other things that hang on if they can survive with very low oxygen levels. We would call that pond a eutrophic pond. It's gone through eutrophication, where it warms up in the summertime and we get this whole algae bloom, and then we get the lack of oxygen taking place. And you're going to find that most of those very shallow ponds or sloughs in this area will go through that, and you'd be hard pressed to find fish in them, I would wager. And that's what we're talking about here. And this is what it might look like. I'm not sure where this picture was taken. It sort of looks like it's in Alberta, based on the species of trees and stuff. But this is an algae bloom that you can see on the water here. Sometimes those algae blooms can affect humans as well. They can cause skin problems with us too. So this could be Pigeon Lake for all I know. I can't remember where I found the picture. I'm going to just circle back to that activity I skipped over. It's in your notes. It might be something you're interested to. It's a thought exercise really for us to think a little bit about water quality. And it gives you an idea of how an aquatic ecologist might reason their way through a problem. So you've been fishing at Lake, I can't think of a name, for years. The fishing has always been very, very good until last year. The fish are smaller, and you seem to only catch one species, not several kinds that you used to catch. The lake itself looks the same. The water is clear and the temperature seems right. And you can see lots of loons and herons on the lake. Loons and herons would be eating fish, by the way, but there seem to be fewer of them. So something's up. And so you've decided to investigate what's going on. So if you guys wanted to do this thought exercise, maybe call somebody up, do a Google Meet, and chat your way through this if you want, or chat with somebody else in your house. But what's going on? Why is the lake this way? What are the reasons that this could be happening? Everything looks healthy, but you're only catching one species of fish, but you're still seeing loons around. The water's clear. The temperature seems right. What's going on with this with Lake? I can't think of a name. So what are you going to look for? How are you going to figure out what's going on? What kind of data or information might you need? Who might you contact? Okay, start to go through and maybe develop a little bit of a plan. And I think I left you some space in your notes to write down a few ideas about what you think is going on in this situation. Why is it this way? Take the time to think your way through this, because it gives you a glimpse into what an ecologist might do if they are investigating something like this. What are the pieces that they need to put together to solve this? All right, so go ahead and do that activity. Find some time to do that. Maybe have a conversation with somebody about it. Hey, fire me an email and say, hey, this is what I think the problem is. Blah, 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 blah. What do you think? And I'll fire you back some information, what I think, and say, yeah, it's great. Or, hey, did you think about this? So this is it. This is the end of the concept. So if you wanted to finish up with those textbook questions on page 389, you can. But definitely please take the time to pop open worksheet number 3 and work through those questions for me. It's going to give you an idea of what I'm going to ask about on the practice quiz and what you can expect me to ask about on the summative quiz when you get to it. The only other thing that I have left to say to you guys is this is basically our second last concept of the year. So we're gonna cover E3 this week, and then next week you're gonna cover E4, and you'll notice that your notes run out at this point, and that's because I'm gonna cover E4 in the form of a little mini project that I'm gonna have you guys do. So you're going to have to spend a little bit of time working your way through a mini project that I've been developing over the last little while for you guys to work on. So we're going to work our way through that next week. for concept E4, and then you guys are done with this stuff. I'll give you a couple of weeks to get caught up, and then we're finished up for the year. If you want the project to drag on a little bit longer, maybe I'll put out some options for replacing a couple of marks, maybe using it as a rewrite, those kinds of things as we go forward. So, hey, if you guys need a hand with anything, fire me an email, pop on for an office hour. We can work out a Google Meet at some other time if that time doesn't work for you. Love to hear from you just to see how you're doing and what's going on. You're getting this video first week of June. So, hey, how's your spring been so far? All of that kind of stuff. Do your practice quiz, wait for feedback from me, move on to the summative quiz after you've had that feedback. I hope you guys are staying healthy. I hope you guys are staying happy. And we will talk very soon for our very last concept in Unit E and in the year, concept E4, coming up next week. See ya.